Welcome back to Hover Unboxed. Today we are finally covering GPU performance in Fortnite. Just give me a moment here. There we go, that's better. So yeah, as I was saying, we are doing a big GPU performance comparison in Fortnite. I feel like this video has been delayed for ages now, but in reality it's really only been about a week. But what a long week it's been. I had planned to release the benchmark results this time last week, but then the Meltdown and Spectre security flaws surfaced and I pretty much got no sleep for almost a week there, so it's all a bit foggy looking back. There's still plenty more to cover on that topic, but for my own sanity, we're taking a break and checking out a lazy 44 GPUs in Fortnite. Unfortunately though, just as I'd wrapped up all my testing, all 44 GPUs done and dusted, NVIDIA emailed me and were like, hey guys, we have a new driver that improves performance in Fortnite. I took a moment to calm myself and then I went back to retest with the new 390.65 driver. I really do enjoy my job. At the top end, I found around a 5% performance boost, though for the most part, mid-range type GPUs, they saw just a 2 to 3% increase, while the bottom feeders got absolutely nothing at all. Anyway, I've now retested all NVIDIA GPUs with the latest driver, and this driver also addresses one of the two Spectre variants that the NVIDIA display drivers are vulnerable to, and I will look into the performance impacts that these fixes have at a later date. So, Fortnite. Why am I testing this game now, you might ask? Well, over a month ago I started testing PUBG and I decided to run a poll on the channel's community section as well as Twitter, asking you guys which game you prefer, PUBG or Fortnite, with a third option being, well, neither of them. 39% of you voted for PUBG and just 26% voted for Fortnite, while a large 35% chunk said that, well, you don't really care for either of them. The result on Twitter was slightly more even, but again, overall, also much the same. Although PUBG is the more popular title, I was still keen to test the less demanding and better optimised Fortnite. And hey, even if you are in the minority, I'm still looking out for you. Plus, it doesn't really hurt that of the two games, I much prefer Fortnite, and admittedly, I haven't really spent a whole lot of time playing either of them, but on the impression that I've got from each title, Fortnite seems like the one that I would personally enjoy more. For those of you unaware, Fortnite did receive a standalone Battle Royale mode late last year. It has been released on Windows, macOS, PlayStation 4 and Xbox One. For now, this is still an early access title as developer Epic Games irons out the kinks, though when compared to PUBG, there really appear to be almost none, at least based on my own experience. The free-to-play Battle Royale mode has proven very popular, and just 2 weeks after its release had obtained over 10 million players. Obviously the Battle Royale genre is extremely popular, but further helping is the fact that Fortnite appears to play very well on just about anything, and as I mentioned, it is free-to-play. Although it is very well optimised, there will be those of you rocking older hardware looking to upgrade to enable higher quality visuals, and this is where this benchmark video will hopefully come in very handy. For testing, I have decided to focus on the higher quality settings rather than the epic settings, as I feel this is where most of you using older hardware or sort of low-end hardware will be aiming to upgrade to. The difference in visual quality between high and epic isn't that noticeable, while the drop in frame rate is, so I felt for most, the high settings probably do make the most sense. Something I'll just touch on before we jump into the benchmarking is the 3D resolution option. Now this was set to epic, it was the only setting set to epic, but setting it to epic does ensure that you see 100% scaling with the selected display resolution. It's a bit confusing, but just setting the display resolution doesn't mean the game will be rendered at that resolution. This just ensures that the HUD will be rendered at the selected resolution. The actual game resolution can be set from 480p, 720p, 1080p or epic. And that's where it's a bit confusing. The epic setting should really just be called 100% scaling. That would make it a lot less confusing for gamers. For the benchmark, I just dropped into the game at the exact same location every time, a busy town, and the moment I hit the ground, I just started running in the same direction every time, taking the same path, and that lasted for 60 seconds, at which point I recorded the result, did that 3 times, and I'm presenting the average of 3 runs. So, having said all that, let's jump into the benchmark results. Let's start with the previous generation GPUs at 1080p, and please note I'm skipping the Radeon RX 400 series entirely, as for the most part the new 500 series is exactly the same, just a little factory overclocking applied here and there. The RX 550 is the only truly new product, while the RX 560 has 2 extra CUs enabled, but overall isn't really that much faster than an RX 460. So if you have a 400 series Radeon GPU, drop a few percent off the 500 figures and that'll put you within the ballpark for your GPU. Okay, so at 1080p using the high quality settings, we find very playable performance on almost all GPUs tested. In fact, the Radeon R7 370 is the only exception here, and that will require you to drop down to medium or possibly even the low quality visuals. For those of you never wanting to drop below 60 FPS, and based on my experience playing this game, staying above 60 FPS at all times makes it significantly easier to aim, so yes, in my opinion that would be desirable. So for this you will require a Radeon R9 390 or a GTX 970. Actually, if we look at those two GPUs for a moment, we find yet another game where the GTX 970, which is now meant to be deader than Trump's candy-coloured head rug, puts a real beatdown on the R9 390. Of course, the game is built upon the Unreal Engine 4, and typically we've found that this game engine does favour the green team, but the point is the GTX 970 is still going very strong, even in relation to other GeForce graphics cards, offering a whopping 24% more frames than the R9 390. Even the GTX 960, which has become a bit of a failure in a number of recently released games, manages to beat the R9 380 and even the 380X. Then we find the GTX 980 leaving the Fury X behind, while the GTX 980 Ti needs the draw distance set to epic before it can even see how far behind the Fury X is. Alright, well let's move on to 1440p and see how things look there. Here we find those wanting to keep the frame rate around 60 FPS as the minimum will require a GTX 980 or a Fury X graphics card, while the GTX 980 Ti and Maxwell Titan X streak ahead, delivering over 80 FPS at all times. For an average of around 60 FPS, the GTX 970 or R9 Nano will suffice. Meanwhile, the R9 390X and 390 weren't too bad, but beyond that you'll really need to turn things down for better frame rates. Then at 4K, even the GTX 980 Ti struggles, and although it was still playable, I did find that around 40 FPS it was really difficult to aim accurately, so again I would prefer around 60 FPS for playing this game. Now it's time to check out the current generation GPUs, and there's a lot more of them. At 1080p, the GTX 1080 Ti, Titan X, GTX 1080 and 1070 Ti are all CPU limited to 150 FPS on average. This isn't a frame cap either. Frame rates would shoot up well over 200 FPS when looking at the sky, for example. For those wondering, the standard GPU test rig was used to test the game, and this packs a Core i7 8700K clocked at 5GHz with DDR4 3200 memory. The good news here being that for an average of 60 FPS, gamers only require a GTX 1050 Ti or an RX 570. The RX 570 also managed to keep the minimum frame rate above 60 FPS, and the 1050 Ti was pretty close at 59 FPS. The drop down to the GTX 1050 wasn't too bad, but the RX 560 really struggled to deliver playable performance. As we saw previously when comparing the GTX 970 and R9 390, Nvidia has a commanding lead in this title, and we do see numerous examples of this with the current generation models as well. Take the GTX 1060 6GB and RX 580 for example. Here the GeForce GPU was 26% faster, hitting 112 FPS on average, and typically we would expect these two GPUs to deliver a similar level of performance. Then at 1440p the margins are reduced, but even so the GTX 1060 remained 20% faster than the RX 580. For an average of 60 FPS you will require an RX 580, but for this title the GTX 1060 3GB is a much better value option as it averaged 67 FPS. Then we have the GTX 1070, which roughly matched Vega 64 Liquid, and the GTX 1080 Ti was 46% faster and actually in danger of being limited by the CPU. Bang for your buck, the GTX 1060 3GB is the standout here, though if you can afford it I would suggest getting the 6GB model. For those of you wanting to play Fortnite at 4K, you will require a GTX 1080 Ti for perfectly smooth gameplay with over 60 FPS at all times. The GTX 1080 wasn't that bad, but again, you would have to lower the quality settings as I found it dips into the 40s and that just made aiming a little too difficult for me. As always, I've thrown everything together into a single big jumbled graph. So here we have all current and previous generation GPUs, and here we have the 1080p results. Feel free to pause here if you want to study them a bit more closely, or you can also go to TechSpot because there is a written version there, and the link will be in the video description. Then moving on to 1440p, and again, if you want to study these numbers a bit more closely, then feel free to hit the pause button. I will just quickly note though that here we can see the GTX 970 matching the RX 580, while the GTX 980 Ti makes an absolute mockery of Vega 64 Liquid. Finally, the 4K numbers, and as they so often do in these big breakdowns, they make the GTX 1080 Ti look extremely mighty. I've decided to continue the Patreon bonus round, which we featured in the PUBG video, and I'll be sticking with the models previously proposed by our much loved patrons. This is basically a super vintage bonus round. GPUs such as the GTX 750 Ti, the 760, the R9 280X, the 290, and the 290X, they were all heavily requested by our Patreon supporters, so let's see how they handle. Starting from the top, we have the GTX 780 Ti, which, as we noted when testing with PUBG, this card's kind of died off a bit in some of the more recently released titles, but that wasn't the case in PUBG, and it's certainly not the case in Fortnite either. Here it pushed out an average of 101 FPS at 1080p using the same high quality settings, and this meant it was just 10% slower than the GTX 1060. The plain old GTX 780 also did well, matching the Radeon RX 580. The R9 290 was quite a bit slower, matching the R9 390 and the RX 570. Then we have the old GTX 680, which only matched the GTX 1050, though this did make it slightly faster than the R9 280X and the Radeon HD 7970GHz edition. The GTX 760 also snuck in there with those Radeon GPUs, so that was interesting to see. The HD 7950 roughly matched the RX 560, while the GTX 660 Ti was faster than both of them. Then finally we have the GTX 750 Ti, which does do surprisingly well for what it is, and it was interesting to see it hanging in there with the old 500 series flagship part, the GTX 580. That particular model uses considerably more power, so yeah, very interesting to see that. Again though, as was the case with all the entry-level GPUs, you will want to reduce the quality settings for improved frame rates, but still 41 FPS on average was decent, and it was a nice step up from the Radeon R7 370. Well, there you have it, a 44 GPU comparison, all tested under the same conditions in Fortnite Battle Royale. Now this should give those of you trying to work out what GPU you need for a desired frame rate. Going into this, we knew that Fortnite was a lot like other games that use the cartoon-style graphics, such as Overwatch and Team Fortress, for example. Artistically, the game looks great, but it's also pretty easy going on the GPU. Still though, if you want to play at 1440p with high-quality settings, or perhaps even the epic settings, you will want something like a GTX 1060 or better, especially if you're like me and you can't aim worth a damn at less than 60 FPS. Now, depending on how much demand there is, I might also do a CPU roundup for this title. So let me know if that's something you're interested in and you want to see it. So yeah, drop that in the comment section below. For now though, that is going to do it for the Fortnite testing. I'll revisit the game later next month when we do get those AMD desktop APUs. That should be very interesting indeed. And Fortnite is the perfect game for testing such a product. Also, if you like the video, then you know what to do. Please hit the like button for us. We really appreciate that. And if you appreciate the amount of time and work that we put into these videos, then perhaps consider supporting us on Patreon. That'll give you a direct line via Discord to demand as many benchmarks as you like. I'm your host, Steve. See you again next time.